Hey YouTube, this is 2Upper LLC, and today we're going to be talking about JavaScript basics. Now, whether you're familiar with JavaScript or not, that's okay. Today we're going to talk all about the basics of JavaScript, how to get started, or maybe if you have been an experienced programmer and just want to refresh back with the basics, that's okay too. So today we're going to be talking about variables, user input, and user output as well. And we're going to be using that all through the console log and terminal within Visual Studio Code. Now, you don't have to use Visual Studio Code. You can use anything as simple as command prompt, PowerShell, or even a terminal in either Linux or Mac OS. But today we're going to be talking about how to use a terminal in Windows, Microsoft Visual Studio Code. Now, let's get started. Now, many of you are wondering, what the heck is a variable? What is that? So let's get started with that. So a variable is a way for us to store user or just data values as well. It doesn't have to be user data values. So let's get an example. So ever since in middle school, we have been learning that x can be equal to some kind of integer or even a decimal value as well. So for this example, we're going to do variable x equals 5. Now, that's a way x is going to be the variable that stores the data value of 5. Now, we can define as many variables as we want. So I'm going to give another example as well. Variable y equals 10. And we can also do other user input things as well, where variable x and variable y can be added together in a different variable, and then you can print out that variable as well. So I'm going to give you an example right now. So we have variable x equals 5, while variable y equals 10. Now, if we have variable z equals x plus y, and we print it out to our screen. Now, a good way for us to print out through the terminal would be console log. Now, if we call console.log and we call our variable z, and we save our file, we can call this file and then we can see our answer. A good way to call our file in the terminal would be called node. If you don't have Node, I recommend downloading it. I would be more than happy to put a link down in the description below, and you can download Node from there. But Node is a way necessarily for us to run our files through a terminal, and it's also useful in many different ways for creating applications as well. Node.myfilename, which is readline.js, and you can see here we got answer 15, which is essentially correct. Now, it doesn't stop with just integer values. So I could give you an example. We can use decimal values as well. So we can make x equal to 1.09, and we can make variable y equal to 11.14. And just like we did before, we can add the two together and print them out to the screen for us to see if our answer is correct. Just call node.filename again, and you can see here we got the correct answer. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what if I don't want to use it for integers or decimal values? That's okay too. So say we have a variable called sentence, or I'm sorry, we call it word. And we have this word say hello. And say we have something called a variable called, in this example, we're going to call it W. And it says world. Say we want to add these two together to print out to the screen hello world. Now, say we have a variable called sentence, and we add word plus W. And say we want a console log sentence. Now say we go back and call our file, and you can see we print out hello world. Now you're probably wondering, well, why do I want to do it this way? There are different ways to define a variable, call a variable, concatenate a variable, which means adding, or even different ways to even have user input into a variable and then you call it. But for this example, we're just starting with the basics and just making sure that you understand how defining a variable works and how many different ways you can define a variable. So let's say we want to call a variable a number of different times. There are a number of different ways that we can do this, but for this example, we're going to stick with something called the for loop. Now, what is a for loop? So a for loop would be a way for us to repetitively call our data or repetitively search for data using something called a variable, which is we're going to define it as I, and we're going to define it as 0. Now, the way we define it as 0 is that means we're going to start at the number 0, and we're going to keep on going until 0 hits 1. And how do we do that? We're going to do something called an increment, where we add 1 to it every single time using the plus sign. Now, there are a number of different ways to do this, but for this example, we're going to keep it simple and just do it this way. Now, I is going to start at 0, and I is less than 10. And every single time we go through, I is going to increment by 1. So from 0, we're going to go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and you can see where the pattern is going. And right here, we can console log our variable. And if we call our file, you can see that it prints out hello world 10 times. Now, you're probably wondering, why do I want to call hello world 10 times? Well, there may be an instance where you don't necessarily want to call hello world 10 times, but maybe you want to call someone's name 10 times, or maybe you have a list of users' names where you have Stacy, Robert, Bob, and maybe you want to go down the list and print them out from each time. But that's something we're going to discuss very later. But for loops is an excellent way to go through data and call data, whether you're calling it repetitively or you're calling each individual thing. Now, you're probably also wondering, how do we get user input, and how do we get print out what the user has inputted? And that's a perfectly good question. So we're going to call our variable called const readline equals required dot readline. Now you're probably wondering, what is this const? Const is a way for us to not change the variable. So for example, if I have the const readline, I want to make sure that whatever is in that readline doesn't get changed later down the road, unless if I specifically ask it. This is basically just a safe and secure way to make sure that our data doesn't get manipulated or get changed without us knowing. And as we go further, I'm going to do a const. I'm going to call this variable R1, and I'm going to call readline the variable that I defined dot create interface. Now you're probably wondering, whoa, what's going on? So as you can see, readline equals required readline. This means that we are going to be able to read throughout the entire string or whatever the user inputs, and we're going to make sure that it gets stored within R1. Now we're going to also make sure that whatever is stored within R1 doesn't get changed, as I mentioned before. And the reason why we're going to use this readline is because I want to make sure that I read the spaces as well. So for example, if I am a user and I input 1, 2, 3, 4 space 5, 6, 7, 8, I want to make sure that everything gets read within. I don't want to make sure that I only read 1, 2, 3, 4 and then it stops at the space. I want to make sure it continues reading the space as well. Because in real life, when people are typing in something as their name, they're typing in their full name. They're not typing in their first and last name, unless if you're specifically asked to. Now, we're going to do const R1 equals readline.create interface. And we're going to be calling our brackets. And we're going to be calling our input for the user to put in what is necessary. And we're going to be calling our output for us to print out what the user put in. Now you're probably wondering, what is all this? What is create interface? What is input process? And what is process.st.out? Now these are all great questions. Now, an interface is an instance of the readline.interface class, which are constructed using the create interface method. Every instance within this create interface is stored within the input for the user to input their process in. Now stdin is a way for users to put in through the keyboard what they need, and it would be stored within that input. And the output stream is used to print the prompts that the user has inputted, and that's where we use the std out as well. Now, this is all very good information. If you want any more information, I will be more than happy to put links down in the description where you can read more about it. And as we continue moving forward, we're going to call our variable called r1, and we're going to call the question function. Now, this is basically, the question function is basically a way for users to make sure to ask a question and have it print on the console, so that way whatever the user needs to answer, we make sure that they're answering the correct type of way. So for example, we're going to call r1.question, and we're going to ask, what is your name? And we're going to call a variable called answer, and that's going to be what the user is going to be storing their input in. It's going to be stored in answer, and we're going to make sure we're going to do a function call, which this is just a simpler way to do it, is use the arrow function. And then we're going to make sure to add a semicolon at the end. And we're going to console log the answer so we can make sure we can see what the user has inputted. And we're going to also close the question so that when we make sure we don't allocate any memory space. Now we're going to call our file again. It's going to say, what's your name? I'm going to put Stacy Smith. And as you can see, it printed out Stacy Smith and included the space. And it also closed the question as well, which made sure that we weren't allocating any more extra memory space, and it closed the program as well. Well, that's it, you guys. I'm be more than happy to include anything that you may have missed or may have not missed. And please, if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And please feel free to give us a like and also give us a subscribe as well if you want to see any new information and videos on computer programming. Thank you so much, and please take care. Bye-bye.